Words of my mouth and the meditations of our hearts be always acceptable unto you, O Lord, our strength and our Redeemer. Please be seated. So you might notice that the Old Testament lesson today is about Father Abraham. This is not because it's Father's Day. This is part of the Sundays after Pentecost, and we are following the first track given in the lectionary, which is a sort of sequential reading of a part of the Old Testament, or a sort of line of Old Testament stories. And this being year A, we're following the story of Abraham. But it is appropriate for Father's Day because not only does Jesus in his little story about the rich man and Lazarus call Abraham Father Abraham, Abraham is the great patriarch of Judaism and is an important patriarchal figure in the other two great monotheistic religions, our own Christianity and Islam. In Christianity, we view Abraham as the father not only of the covenant of God with Israel, but the covenant that God makes with every believer through Jesus Christ. In Islam, Abraham is one of the line of prophets of Islam leading up to the prophet Muhammad. And it's appropriate for Father's Day also because Abraham was a man who really wanted to be a father. We only read snippets of the stories of Abraham from Genesis. Last week we read from the beginning of the Abraham story, which is the first recounting of the covenant, the promise that God makes to Abraham, then called Abram. In chapter 12 of Genesis, where the Lord said to Abram, "Go forth from your land and your birthplace and your father's house to the land I will show you, and I will make you a great nation." Our reading today is from chapter 18 of Genesis. So we've skipped over 6 chapters. And in those 6 chapters, there are repeated stories of God's promise to Abraham. And the fact that despite God's promise to Abram continues childless. So in chapter 15, for example, the word of the Lord came to Abram in a vision and said, "Fear not, Abram, I am your shield. Your reward shall be very great." And Abram said, "Oh, my master, Lord, what can you give me when I am going to my end childless, and the steward of my house is Damasek Eliza?" And God says that, this one will not be your heir, but he who issues from your loins will be your heir. And look up to the stars and count them if you can, so shall be your seed. And Abram trusted in the Lord. Abram really wanted to have children, probably specifically a son. Something else we don't hear from today's reading is that at the time that the Lord came to Abram and Sarah laughed, Abram already had a son. The son's name was Ishmael, and his mother was Hagar, a slave of Sarah. And Abraham had pled with God to give the blessing to Ishmael. And God said, "No, your heir is going to be the son of Sarah." But we can see in there Abraham's love for his child, that he wanted Ishmael to be the one to inherit when Ishmael was the only son he had. At another time, we'll talk about the ways in which Abraham was a less than perfect father, unless you consider almost sacrificing your son to God a sign of being a good father. But I want us to think about these two things. Abraham really wanted to be a father, and that we know only little bits of the story of Abraham. Because is that not the case with our own fathers? That we know only little bits of their story. Like the ancient biblical scholars composed a chronology and a story of Abraham from the stories that had been passed down to them, and it's sort of a patchwork. We compose the story of our fathers from the stories that are passed on to us. And it's a patchwork. And we fill in the gaps with speculation and with our own experience. How many of you have had the sorrow of your father dying and going to their memorial service or funeral and hearing stories from other people who knew them in other contexts, filling in some of those gaps, and maybe also telling us that, our childhood understanding of our fathers is not really very accurate or very complete. As a child, we look to them to fulfill our needs, to guide us. We desperately want their approval. Sometimes we feel that we get it, and sometimes we feel we don't get it. Maybe our father was absent. Maybe our father was too present in micromanaging our lives, the modern helicopter parent. Parenthood is hard, and none of us get it right all the time. Those of you who are fathers, I bet you can look back and think, if I had known then what I know now, I would have handled that differently. I was thinking about my own father in the last few days and thinking how young he was when he became a father. My father was only 24 years old when I was born. Before he finished his graduate education, he was the father of 3 children. When I look back and I think, he really didn't know what he was doing at all, did he? My mother once told me that he kissed us goodnight because Dr. Spock said that a father should do that. My father was someone who learned how to navigate the world through books. Sometimes they served him well, and sometimes they didn't serve him so well. But I think part of our job in our lifetimes is to forgive our fathers. Even if they were really good fathers, there's a little piece of us that maybe was hurt by them at some point. And before we die, for the sake of our souls and for the sake of our self-understanding, we should forgive them. When I think about the good things that I remember from my father, I actually think about the reading that we heard from the gospel today and the disciples being sent out. Because what did Jesus send the disciples out to do? He sent them to go among the people that they understood and to bring a word of hope and some healing, and to put themselves out in doing it. Think about the memories of your father that you cherish. And I wonder if you don't find in those memories some combination of those things, of hope, of healing, and of putting themselves out for your sake. One of the most unexpected things that my father did was when I was probably about 12, and my parents had probably inadvisedly purchased a horse for my little sister. I say inadvisedly because neither of my parents had ever owned a horse, neither of them rode. We lived in the suburbs and didn't have any place to keep the horse. It was one of those impulsive things in response to my sister's tears at learning that the stable that she had been riding at was closing down and her favorite horse was going to be sold. So for a while, this horse lived in the garage of the suburban house. And my mother would take him for walks around the neighborhood since and then one of the neighbors complained and we discovered that the garage was too close to that house on that side to meet code. And so the horse was stabled at a stable some ways away, and my poor parents had to drive my sister there for her to ride, and it turned out the horse was only partially trained and, trained well enough to follow another horse on the trail, but not well enough to be trusted in an arena. So I thought I wanted to ride. I didn't know how to ride, but I tried to ride Whiskey, as the horse was named. Well, Whiskey didn't like this idea at all. So he stood stock still and then he set off at a gallop and I fell off. Was dragged a little bit by my foot being caught in the stirrups. And my father, this unathletic college professor, ran into the arena and picked me up and carried me to the car and drove me to the hospital. I didn't know my father could pick me up. I was full grown at age 12. I don't think he could have if it wasn't for that surge of adrenaline and protective energy. But he was acting in compassion, and taking me for healing, and putting himself out. And I think those are how a good father does it on his best days. I think that we don't talk enough about fathers, not in the sense of the man who plays golf or mows the lawn or, coaches a sports team, but the man who yearns for a child, the man who views his children as a gift. And whether they are young, as my father was, or old beyond biological possibility, as we are told Abraham was, when that child arrives, and they hold him or her, it's a gift. And they view it as a gift. And they do their very best to love and protect and teach and share hope, to share what healing they have found in the world. And in that way, perhaps being like the disciples, perhaps being like Abraham. Today, perhaps if your father is still alive, give them a telephone call. If your children are alive, maybe give them a telephone call. They probably won't make you an ashtray. That's what we always did for Father's Day when I was a child in school. Make a gift for your father. Make an ashtray. Here, kill yourself with cigarettes. It's impossible to buy a gift for your father. Anything that they actually need, they have or you can't afford. But maybe they'll talk to you. Maybe share a story with them that they haven't heard before. Share a little snippet of your life that will help them fill in those blank spaces that they don't know. Maybe it reveals something that you weren't ready to share with them when they were young, when you were trying to be the all-knowing and all-protective father. Now that you're both grown, you don't have to pretend. You can let them know. Sometimes you didn't know what you were doing. Sometimes you did things that you wish you hadn't done. Some memories you cherish. Tell them how you felt when they were born. Share the time when you first really felt like a father. Give them that gift. Maybe they will give you a gift of love in return.